Recording in progress. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Owls of Vermont. My name is Lisa Sawsville, and I'm your host with Vermont Coverts, Woodlands for Wildlife. We're excited to have you on board today. We ask that you mute yourself if you aren't already muted. Your cameras can be on or off. That's entirely up to you. When it comes to questions, if you can type them in the chat box, and I'll relay them to Jill, either in the middle if it seems appropriate, or I'll wait till the end and we'll have a little discussion at the end with your questions. Vermont Coverts is always excited to bring to you these kinds of programs. You have probably learned about it from a number of different ways, whether it be through our e-news or one of the social medias or one of our partners. You're welcome to sign up for our e-news online at www.vtcoverts.org and also make a donation there to the organization to support programs like this. And with that, I'm going to introduce Jill Kilborn. Jill is a wildlife diversity biologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. She's been with the department about 2 years with a focus on avian species. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jill.
Thank you, Lisa. Hi, everybody. I see some familiar faces out there. So it's good. I'm glad you were able to join us this afternoon. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about Owls of Vermont. And I just feel like I need to give a shout out to the Northwood Stewardship Center because this was a presentation that they had shared with me that I adapted for today's talk. So just some quick background on Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. I feel it's always important to let people know what the mission is of the department. We are here to conserve all fish, wildlife, plants, and habitats for people of Vermont. And I just want to make sure, I don't know why that automated through. So hopefully it doesn't keep doing that. So what we conserve, everything from natural communities and fish and habitats to invertebrates like bees and insects to wildlife and plants. Does anybody know, Lisa, do you know how to turn that off, the automatic advanced? I don't know why it's doing that.
It's probably on a timer. Is there a timer in the lower right on the... Yeah, somewhere there should be a timer or... Let me go do some quick...
Let me see if I can get that to work. So the different groups that we serve include wildlife watchers, future generations, anglers and hunters, as well as communities and landowners. So we really cover the gamut when it comes to the different services that we provide as a department. I also like to put a plug in here. As Lisa mentioned, I am part of the non-game or the diversity program within Vermont Fish and Wildlife, and there's a variety of ways that you can help support this program. So for those of you who don't know, Vermont Fish and Wildlife is funded through federal aid grant funds that come in from an excise tax on hunting equipment, and then we match that with a 25% match, typically from license sales, but also from a lot of donations that come in from the public. So I always like to shout out these different ways that you can contribute if you're not a hunter or an angler to the department. So the Vermont Habitat Stamp is actually not really a stamp. It's a pot of funds that you can go to and contribute to that directly goes to habitat work on the ground. And then the other fund that I like to plug is the Non-Game Wildlife Fund, which is specifically the funds that go to the diversity program, and that helps to fund everything from plants to invertebrates to a lot of the species that can't be covered by the federal excise tax, which can only be used on mammals and birds here nationwide, actually. So at the bottom of the screen, you'll see there's an actual link there that shows where you can go to make donations to any of those funds. And there's a variety of other options on that website as well to contribute to. So today we're going to be talking about owls specifically. So what makes an owl an owl? Some of their amazing adaptations that they have, who's who in the owl world here in Vermont, and then of course what we can do for owl conservation here in the state of Vermont. So what makes an owl an owl? Well, owls are a part of the raptor family, which simply means they're birds of prey. They predate on small mammals and other small insects or invertebrates. So they're in this category with things like eagles and peregrine falcons, even turkey vultures, and red-tailed hawks. But they have some very specific adaptations as owls that make them even more efficient at doing all of these things. So the first thing is their feet. They have very strong, very well adapted feet for grabbing the prey that they're going after. So the picture over here in the red actually shows a songbird foot, and you can see they have long, slender toes, and still have those sharp kind of claws for holding onto branches and things. But the owls really have these strong toes with exceptionally sharp nails or claws that help them capture their prey. Once they have their prey, they also have very strong and very sharp beaks that helps them pull that prey apart so that they can either feed their owls or actually consume whatever they've caught. The owls will eat everything essentially whole, and a lot of people realize that when there's things that they can't digest, like bones and feathers and fur, they actually regurgitate that and leave what are known as owl pellets. So it's a kind of a telltale sign. If you find a pile of pellets somewhere, typically there's probably a cavity right above your head where the owl's been hanging out. Eyes are the other adaptation that a lot of people think of when we think of owls. Specifically, they talk about if our eyes were as big as an owl's eyes are in its head, they'd be the size of a grapefruit. So just imagine somebody with two massive grapefruits on their face, and that's essentially what we have when we have owls here. So those eyes are built specifically to pull in as much light as possible so that they can hunt at night. And so because they are so large, they are fixed in the front of the owl's head. So essentially they have tunnel vision that goes straight out in front of them to accommodate the very large eyes that they have. Those eyes are pulling in all the possible light because a lot of us know owls are actually hunting at night and most active at night. So they need all the possible light that they can. There's been estimates that say that they have 100 times more ability to see at night than people do because of these adaptations. They also have a specific membrane on the back of their retina that allows more of that light to be concentrated in their eye, as well as a high concentration of rods, which are those light gathering parts of the eye. So they don't have a whole lot of contrast when it comes to color in their vision, but it has a huge amount of ability to pull in light and see slight movements because of those eye adaptations. They also have a specific membrane, like a third membrane that goes over the top of their eye that's specifically used to protect their eyes when they're flying through the forest so that if they get whacked in the face, they can protect their eyes, but also from their young that are often grabbing at them trying to get food when they bring it back to the nest. So when you have eyeballs that are that big, you have to have a specific adaptation to figure out how to turn your neck to use those eyes. So owls actually have additional vertebrae in their necks so that they can turn up to 270 degrees in their head turning. So often you'll see pictures of an owl turning its head, and it can actually turn its head almost all the way to the back. And then again, the other side all the way to the back. And that's really so that they can use those eyes to hunt for the species that they're looking for. Owls are exceptionally well camouflaged, and this allows them to sit still in a tree or in the areas that they hunt to look for their prey. And then they have these specific adaptations for feathers. So if anybody's familiar with a peregrine or has been close to a peregrine that has swooped by, it's almost listening to a jet plane swoop by. They make this really loud noise. And those feathers are super aerodynamic, but they make that noise as a result. Owls, on the other hand, have what are called these little filaments that kind of come off the edges of the feathers, and as they fly, the air moves through those filaments and it actually makes the flight silent. So even though they're not moving as fast as a peregrine would be flying, they are moving silently through the forest because of this adaptation. And this is actually really cool. If you pick up an owl feather, or if you find a feather out in the woods and you pick it up, you can actually see those filaments on the edge of the feather until, like, when you touch it, it's super soft to the touch. And it's often the best way to tell the difference between a feather from, say, a songbird or a raptor versus a feather that comes from an owl that you find out in the woods. So the next adaptation, we'll talk about our ears. So as the great horned owl or some of the long-eared owl has these feathers on top of the head, those are not actually ears. The owl's ears are actually located on the sides of their head. And they are placed in offset positions on either side. And this allows them to take in noise and really hone in on exactly where the noise is coming from, because they have the ability to kind of triangulate based on how they're hearing and it's coming into the sides of their head. And so those ears allow owls to actually figure out movement under the snow. So this is a picture of a great gray owl that can actually find prey up to 12 to 13 inches under snow, just using their hearing and being able to figure out exactly where that noise is coming from. So I think this is always a good point to talk about some of the limitations for owls, especially here in Vermont. So fortunately, this winter we're having a real winter, and we've had a lot of snow and cold temperatures. The cold temperatures themselves can be a little bit stressful for owls because they actually have to hunt for more food. So if the snow conditions get too deep, and the conditions are too cold for an extended period of time, owls will actually have a hard time getting enough food to stay warm through the winter. Deep snow conditions, once you get over 18 inches of snow, typically that can be really tough on owls on our landscape, especially our smaller owls. So something like a saw-whet owl or even a screech owl are not adapted to dealing with those deep snow conditions. I think the other really important point to make, and Vins down in Quechee, Vermont, has actually found and compared some data on this, is that as we get winters that are warmer and we have winters with more hard crust and ice, those winters are actually the most difficult for a lot of our owl species. And essentially it's because that crust on top of the snow prevents the owl from being able to break through that snow and access the food that's under the snow. So often when we see owls that are struggling, they're coming out during the day to try and hunt for different animals. And we often hear stories of them hanging close to people's feeders. So in this situation, if you start seeing an owl that's hanging out during the day, it's hanging out close to a feeder in your yard, just keep a close eye on it. If you feel like it's something you need to contact a rehabber for, that's the best course of action in that situation. So who's who for Vermont owls? So this is the big 7 that we have here in Vermont, and I'll go through each of them and most in depth in the top 3 there that we have here in Vermont. So the species on the right-hand side of the screen are on the opposite side of the arrow. These are the ones that are the least common here in Vermont, all the way over to our most common species, which includes the barred owl, the great horned owl, and the northern saw-whet owl. So the barred owl. Barred owls are by far our most common species here in Vermont. The distribution is kind of the Midwest through the Northeast. They're territorial and can inhabit about a 6-acre area that they establish their territory in. They're usually a contiguous forest species, but can be found closer to fields, but really like to have contiguous forest on the landscape. They do overlap a bit in home ranges, so you can get multiple pairs kind of occupying a similar area. For barred owls, the females are typically larger than the males, and the male has a larger voice box, which simply means that they make a lower sounding call. and I forgot to play. So this is your typical barred owl. So the who cooks for you, who cooks for you all is kind of the mnemonic that people use. And then they have a clatter or a chatter that they do as well.
Just an FYI, we're not hearing those.
Oh no,
I
that's a
know, isn't
bummer.
that a bummer?
Okay. So the who cooks for you, who cooks for you all is the song that you hear the barred owl do. They eat small rodents and squirrels, will take rabbits and roosting birds as well as crows. And their natural predator on the landscape or primary natural predator is actually the great horned owl. So there's a lot of competition between those two species. They are a cavity nester, but will use stick nests sometimes as well. And they usually begin nesting in March or April. Vocalizations are probably most common late in the winter and early in the spring, and they have 1 to 3 owlets or chicks, essentially. Barred owls are vocal all throughout the year, though, and are easily coaxed in calling back and forth for people that are really good with an owl call and can do it. So here's the great horned owl. So also fairly common in Vermont, but not nearly as common as the barred owl. Found all throughout North America and portions of South America. It's a fairly large owl, and they have these ear tufts. This is your typical owl call. So when people think of the whoo, whoo, that's the great horned owl that's making that noise. So if you don't hear the who cooks for you all, who cooks for you as part of that call, most likely it is the great horned owl that you're hearing. Great horned owls are fairly flexible in habitat. They too like to have forest on the landscape, but they are kind of like an interface species as well. So they'll utilize more open habitats as well as places where people are inhabiting landscape. So they're on territory year round, super territorial. And if they have barred owls in their territory, they will push them out, or like I said, will actually predate on barred owls. They usually have 2 to 5 owlets in a brood, and they start hooting in the fall through early January. They're super early nesters, so we can often see them nesting as early as February here in Vermont. And they are probably the most variable in the nest sites that they will use. They are not dependent on cavities. They often take over stick nests from other species such as red-tailed hawks. So like I said, they're very territorial and will exclude other owls from the area. So our next species is the northern saw-whet owl. So this species is found throughout North America. And it is one of our only owl species that does short migrations. So you will find that sometimes these owls will move out for different periods of time and then come back north, essentially, to their territories. One of the ways that I like to tell this species from its close looking relative, the boreal owl, is on the face. If you look really close, you can see the white streaks on its head are in the shape of what like a saw would do if a saw was moving across the head of the saw-whet owl. That's how I always remembered it in ornithology. A boreal owl has circles on the top of its head, and I always thought of that as like trees popping up out of the top of the boreal owl's head, and that's how I kind of remember the difference between the two species. Northern saw-whets like
working.
what's that? Oh, saw-whets like coniferous type cover, and often you find that in the places where they like to nest. So the pairs form in midwinter, and they're nesting possibly starting in February, but most likely in March. They're secondary cavity nesters, so essentially they take over cavities that have been created by other species, such as pileated woodpeckers, and different types of species that create cavities. They usually have 3 to 7 owlets, and the vocalizations are most common in late winter and early spring during that nesting period. They will readily use nest boxes, and like I mentioned before, they do short migrations during the winter months of the year. All right, now we're going to get into some of the ones that are a little bit less common here in Vermont, but still can be found. We're kind of still within the core range of the species that I'll be talking about here. So the next one is the screech owl. Screech owls are another one of our smaller owls that are really adapted to being on human landscapes. So you often find them in that human field kind of urban interface. And are readily using nest boxes that are put out by folks, found primarily Midwest and throughout the Northeast. So they begin nesting usually in March through June. As you notice, a lot of these owls are nesting in the winter months, which is common for owls. They have 3 to 5 owlets, and their vocalizations are most common in the late summer, early fall when they're first dispersing or setting up their territories. Again, they readily use nest boxes. This is one of the most prevalent species that people are putting boxes out for, and they get really good use rates in. Just a note for a lot of owl species, even though they use a nest box one year, it doesn't guarantee that they're going to come back and use that box again the next year. So we often recommend that folks clean the boxes out from year to year, and it may entice another pair to come in and use a box. So the next species that we have here in Vermont are barn owls. This species is fairly uncommon unless you're in the Champlain Valley, where we have some of these really open landscapes, agricultural landscapes. They typically hunt those open areas all through the winter. One of the, I think, most stunning or striking species of owls that we have here for sure, with that really white face. I think they're absolutely beautiful. So the other 2 species of owls that I need to mention in the 7 for Vermont are the short-eared owl, which is the one over here, and then the long-eared owl. Very uncommon breeders here in Vermont, but there are documented sites or breeding locations for both of these species. Probably more likely a species that are going to be moving through here in Vermont. So not super common to see, but definitely historically there has been nesting in the state for these 2 species. So finally, our uncommon visitors. So the top, my left here, is the boreal owl. So like I was saying, it has the circles on its head, unlike the saw-whet that has the streaks on the head. So another small owl, looks very similar to saw-whets, but that's the easiest way I feel to tell them apart. Northern hawk owl, the great gray owl, and of course the snowy owl. All of these species are visitors from the north. So in years where we have a lack of food source up north and they're looking for more food further south, or we have an abundance of food further south, we get eruptions of these species visiting us here in Vermont during the winter months. Again, a lot of these species are most commonly seen specifically in the Champlain Valley, in those open agricultural landscapes, primarily because these species are occupying open tundra habitat in their natural habitat further to the north. The one exception to this is the boreal owl, and this one can be found in a variety of places if they move further south. So how can people help owls? I think one of the most important things to remember is habitat protection. Many of the owls that we've talked about today are really susceptible to fragmentation and habitat loss. Specifically, as forests become parcelized for development or roads get put through forests that chunk them up into smaller pieces, and can be really detrimental to the amount of habitat for owls. When parcels are also fragmented, it gives advantages to species that are more able to deal with those conditions. So just think about a barred owl being really sensitive to having an interaction with a great horned owl. And as the landscape gets more fragmented and split up, then there's less and less habitat for those barred owls and more for the great horned owls that are super competitive and will push other species out. And it just speaks to the real importance of contiguous blocks of forested habitat on our landscape. I think the other thing that is important to mention here is our agricultural and open landscapes that we have here in Vermont. Our working landscape is really important to a lot of different species, and that habitat diversity is really important to a lot of different species. Owls are dependent on those open habitats for hunting and for small mammal abundance. So that working landscape and diversity of habitats are really important here in Vermont as well. Some of the specific forest habitat management things that we think about when it comes to owls, as I mentioned, many of them are cavity nesters. So we're always thinking about different ways to maintain or even enhance the number of cavities that we have in our forests here in the Northeast. So over a long history of forest management, there's a real lack of older, bigger trees that are dying and are providing the conditions needed for a lot of our cavity nesting species. So in any management practices, we recommend trying to retain a minimum of 6 trees, either standing dead or trees that have cavities in them already per acre. And this can include even creating trees to kind of recruit into the future for these types of purposes. So either through girdling trees or even just identifying big old trees with lots of decay and defect that will eventually turn into trees with lots of cavities and structure for a variety of wildlife species. Key to this practice is really making sure that at least one of those trees is greater than 18 inches in DBH. And we often recommend at least 3 exceeding 12 inches DBH. And this really is because it's those larger diameter trees that form the big cavities that can actually accommodate some of these bigger species like the barred owl or even the great horned owl. The other thing to really think about in forest management is long-term retention areas, specifically placing that around some of these active cavity trees or the raptor nests that we have. I think it's just in general a good practice to kind of maintain diversity within the forest to have these retention areas, but also it helps to buffer these features on the landscape for species to still be able to use them even after some type of management. And then the last thing I think I'll mention for forest management is chop and drop. So we talk about actually identifying trees to cut down and leave on the forest floor, specifically because that deadened down is really important structure for a lot of prey species like small mammals that will hide and utilize that structure on the forest floor. It creates pockets underneath the snow in the wintertime for them to create tunnels and move around in networks under the snow. But it's also really important for forest regeneration. There's specific species of trees such as spruce that actually regenerates much better when it has that substrate of decaying wood that's fallen down onto the forest floor. Some of the other habitat enhancement things that we talk about are nest boxes. As I mentioned, several of these species will actively use nest boxes and they can be placed out on the landscape. I would just cautious, or there's all sorts of different resources online and you can go in and actually look up specific designs for each of the different species that we've talked about. I'll just note that in this design that's here on this page, the opening specifically into the box is a 3.5-inch radius. And that's really important because it allows the species to get in and out of the box, but it also prevents other species from being able to get in the box like a predator such as a raccoon. So sizing that hole based on the recommendations that are out there is really important. The other thing that I'll note is like often they incorporate drain holes to make sure that moisture content doesn't get too much in the box if there's a leak or something. And if possible, cleaning the box out annually, like I mentioned before, is a way to try and entice more pairs to use the box so that it gets used multiple years. And I think that's it for that one. So I think fresh on everybody's mind right now, just because of it's been in the news so much, is disease and pathogen risk for a variety of different species, but specifically with highly pathogenic avian influenza. So HPAI is what we commonly refer to it. And owls are susceptible to HPAI because they're eating prey that have been infected by it. So either waterfowl that has been infected and weakened and still moving, and the owls are able to capture them and feed on that. And that's how they're transmitting it. HPAI is something that's on our landscape. It's been on this landscape for at least the past 2 years to a significant level. And it's kind of a waiting game to see where this is going to end up bringing a lot of the different populations that are being impacted by it. There's nothing that we can do specifically at this point to stop the spread. And it's really about colonial birds and how they're interacting with the different species on the landscape. The other thing that I think that's really important to mention here are rodenticides. I think we're starting to find that the use of rodenticides is probably far more common that we realized on the landscape. And we're seeing that there's a lot of exposure happening throughout the food web with a variety of different species. And owls are part of that exposure pathway. So they're picking up, obviously, the mice or small rodents that are picking up the rodenticide, and then either getting lethal or sublethal doses that can have impacts on the species moving forward. So just I think promoting the non-use of rodenticides on our landscape from a wildlife standpoint is really important. Owls are also really susceptible to vehicle strikes. This is because they're coming out to the roads to hunt for a lot of prey in the evening, which makes it hard for us to see them. And then they'll swoop down looking to capture something and end up getting inadvertently struck by a car on the road. So it's just being vigilant about keeping an eye out for these species. I think there's some practices of the way we manage our roadsides and kind of keeping vegetation mowed back and cut back so that there's less small mammal abundance in these areas. But just reach out if you do happen to hit one and it's injured. That VINS is one of our rehab centers here in Vermont, and they're great about taking raptors and taking all the precautions that are needed for doing rehab in that situation. And then the final piece that I think I'll throw out there is just supporting the science. So owls are really difficult to study because they are out at night, and that tends to be not when people are out surveying or looking for birds. And so adding whatever data that you can to outlets such as eBird, where we can actually document the different sightings of species throughout North America, is a really great tool, but also really supporting groups that are doing research. Vermont Institute of Natural Science, again, has been a great partner. They just started up doing collaborative work with northern saw-whets, where they're banding saw-whets to get a better handle on their distribution and migration patterns. So participate if you can in night surveys, and whatever financial support you can find for these types of outlets for this type of work, I think is really important for owls here in Vermont. And I think that is all I had. So if anybody has any questions, I can open up for questions.
There's a few in the chat box, Jill. Just give me 1 second. There are some people who are asking if we can try and go back and play the sounds. And I have a fix that might work that I figure we could try. If you unshare and then reshare the PowerPoint, and it says in the bottom left corner of the share screen, you can select the share sound checkbox. So if you try and share your screen, let me know if you see that share sound checkbox.
Share sound checkbox, look at that.
Yeah, that's new to me.
All right, let's see if it works.
So I don't know if you want to go back and find a couple of sounds to share.
Make everybody dizzy flipping back through these. Let's do the barred owl again.
Barred owl.
And then the cackle. That one's always fun to hear. All right, let's see if we can get the great horned owl.
Great horned owl.
Low, guttural, spooky. The one you always hear when people talk about owls. Some frogs in the background. All right. This one's my favorite. I think of this one as a saw moving back and forth, like a squeaky saw.
Northern saw-whet owl.
I actually had one nesting in my barn one spring, and that noise was loud and quite irritating with the window open every morning and every evening. And see one for the screech owl. Here's our barn owl. High pitch screech. Not a very pleasant sound. All right. And I think there was a couple in here. This is the great gray.
Great gray owl.
So similar to the great horn, but lower, a little bit faster paced. All right, I think that was it for the sounds.
Great. Thanks for going back and playing those. And look, we learned something. I want to thank Michael in the beginning who pointed that out and helped share that so we could hear those. So thank you, Michael. So the few questions, let's start with do owls prey on songbirds like bluebirds?
They do. I think especially if they get hard up for food. Bluebirds are one of our first ones to arrive if they ever leave here in Vermont in certain parts of the state. So I think, yeah, owls are pretty opportunistic. So if they need to, they will definitely prey on songbirds for sure.
All right. Eilette asks, what is the optimal placement for nest boxes and how long does it take to get an owl to use it?
I wish I knew. I would say if you hear owls close by, that is probably the most optimal situation, but chances are they've probably found a nest spot. But being that they move nest spots from year to year, like putting up a box in a place where you're hearing owls is probably a good place to start. And as for placement, it's really dependent on the species. So like some species do really well close to field edges and they want to be close to those field edges, but other species want to be in the interior of the forest. So it's really species dependent. And like I said, there is a pile of information out there online for different recommendations. So if there's a specific species you're thinking about, just go and do a little bit of research and I bet you'll find some recommendations on where to put the boxes themselves.
There's a question about climate change, and do we anticipate that climate change will affect either favorably or unfavorably any one or all of these species and their distribution and occurrence here in Vermont?
Yeah, they talk a little bit, like I touched on it a bit with our winters resulting in more warmer conditions that result in more snow crusting conditions, or ice conditions that are really detrimental to owls. So it can be really tough, especially for our smaller owls. So anything from essentially the barred owl down in size has a really hard time, like essentially breaking through that crust layer to try and access the prey under the snow. With that being said, when we have really open winters without snow, and then the small mammals and rodents and things don't have that insulating protective layer of the snow, I think some of the species actually can do better in those conditions. So it's probably like going to be somewhere in the middle and a bit of a balancing act. We don't really know exactly um, which species are going to be the benefiters and which ones are going to be detrimental with all the climate changes that we're having. So I think we simply don't know exactly where that's going to land.
So Michael wants to know if there are any tips for seeing owls. And Terry had noted actually earlier that there was a boreal owl seen up in the Burlington area. So
Yeah.
how do we see these things in this,
Yeah. So tracking sightings on sites like eBird, where birders tend to post different sightings, joining. There's listservs out there. There's the Vermont Bird listserv, where you can actually join, and there's links for that, both through Vermont Center of Eco Studies. You can access those links, and if you just do like bird birding groups Vermont, a lot of those links will come up as well. And those group chats and group interchanges are great for kind of figuring out like really good places to go birding and to find different species. And then the eBird website that's maintained out of Cornell in New York is another really great resource. So you can go in, you can go to that website, you can type in a species, and it will pop up all the locations where that species has been observed over as long as they've been tracking it. And you can filter it down to just the locations for this winter, or you can look at them for the past 50, 30 years, whatever they have in the database for data for those species. Some people do use callback as a method for owls. Like I said, they're very territorial, so they will respond to going out and playing either the song or the sound that they make. Or some people are really adept at using actual calls where they can call an owl in. I just caution people to not do that too much. It can be very stressful on a bird to bring it in during territorial times when they get really anxious if they feel like there's another owl invading their area. So just be very cautious in doing that and don't do it too much. And also be aware of like the interactions with multiple species. Like when you're calling, say, a great horned owl for a barred owl, that's really probably a strenuous kind of thing for the owl. So those are probably the big ones that come to mind for folks.
and do you find it's easier to look like, I always find like, you look closer to the trunk of the tree, like for owls versus, out on the end of the branches. Are there any other tricks or tips that you might share like that?
Yeah, and I think I can count on my hand the number of times that I've actually been able to spot an owl in the woods. They're just so well camouflaged. I think the times that I've been most able to see them is just when I've been sitting in silent and I listen to where the call's coming from, when they're calling on the landscape, and just kind of watching and listening if they start to move around, and then moving my location to see if I can kind of intercept where that bird's moving around the landscape to try and see it.
Yeah, for me, it's like I flush them, right? You walk nearby and suddenly like, oop,
Yeah.
there they are. Tracy was wondering, in what way do barred owls interact with saw-whets?
That's a great question. I'm not sure. I think the barred owls are far less territorial than the great horns, so I think there's more overlap probably in those two species and the places that they occupy. It's probably more dependent on like a barred owl liking hardwood and mixed wood type forests. So forests that have both a mix of spruce and fir, but also some of our hardwood trees like maples and yellow birch and that kind of things. Whereas the saw-whets are probably more in just the softwood type habitat. So things like spruce specifically, I think they really key in on the landscape. So probably some overlap, but more of a habitat based kind of partitioning for where they are in the landscape.
Great. There's a question of why will great horned owls prey on skunks, but other owls do not?
Because they're willing to be sprayed? I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure.
I wonder if it has to do with their size at all. I don't know either. I'm just speculating.
Yeah, they are one of the bigger owls, so they're probably more willing to take some of that bigger prey, whereas the smaller owls won't. Yeah.
Eric says he's trying to do some natural cavities. I've drilled 3.5-inch holes, 13 feet up in some snags. Anything else I can do to attract saw-whet and screech? Southern exposure on holes.
No, I can't think of anything specifically. It would be, yeah, I think one of the best ways is if you can get something native, like some other species, to use the cavity and kind of like really excavate it out and probably use it and create more of that internal cavity condition that the owls like. So like a pileated woodpecker or something that's going to end up kind of using that cavity, and then another species, the owl, will move into it. But other than that, no, I think that's really interesting, and I would love to hear if he has any success with it, because that's an interesting idea.
All right, you heard her, Eric. Let her know. Let us know. We'd love to know. I know we've had wood duck boxes where they roost in the winter, and then they'll also be there. The few of them will nest in wood duck boxes in the summer. So, putting out a nest box nearby, maybe they'll choose the nest box over the man-made drilled cavity. I don't know. These are some great things to figure out. Tracy noticed in the photos of the owl's skulls, there was sort of a funnel shape where the eyes sit, and she was wondering if that's bone or cartilage.
I believe that is bone. And that's, again, getting back to the formation of their eyes, and the reason their eyes are very locked in to kind of the forward because they're so large that they need those structure to support the eyes. And that's again why they can actually turn their head, because their eyes are kind of locked, so they have to turn their head so that they can be able to see. Unlike us, which we have the 180 peripheral vision, they're more locked into that 90-degree directly in front of them.
Okay, great. Another question. In the hard crust snow times, can you put out food like liver or something? Would that attract them?
I think a lot of our owls really like live prey. So I'm not sure that putting out something like liver would be super effective. Maybe if you had an owl that was super hungry, it might help, but they're really keying in on live prey, because that's what they're adapted to do with their eyes, and their hearing and all parts of them. So I think they're more prone to just being adapted to live prey.
That's great. I want to note, that Jillian provided a lot of habitat things that we can do to improve our woods. And that's what's really important is, habitat connectivity and healthy forests. And I'm going to share a link in for those of you that aren't familiar with or don't know about the Coverts Cooperator Training. It's a 3-day program that works with landowners and others about sound forest management and wildlife stewardship and what kind of things we can do to help create healthy forests, particularly in the face of climate change and some of the things that our forests are facing health-wise, like invasive species, both plant and animal. So I'll put a link into the chat for that. And if anybody has any other questions, just put those in the chat as well, and we'll relay some of those. And I want to point out that I was really fascinated. For me, I never knew. I mean, I knew about the lens cover for owls, for protection. I never thought about it as protection from the young while they're, I just never really thought of it. So that was a new fact for me. So thank you for that.
Can be chaotic in that cavity.
I'm sure, I'm sure. Um, I see that Kate has her hand up. Kate, I'm hoping you can type the question into the chat. We'd love to know what that question is and answer that for you. That would be great. And is there anything else about owls? I will say, as far as banding, Dead Creek Day, which is in the fall every year, there is usually some evening banding of saw-whets up at a nearby sugar house. One of a local bander here who works with raptors and passerines. He'll do passerines in the morning, and then he'll do the raptors in the afternoon, and with a focus on saw-whets. And you can see the saw-whets up close while they're banding, and they're so tiny, and they end up having to play the calls to attract them to the nets during migration. So the whole process, and you get to go out to the nets and see how they get them out of the nets. It's a great thing to do if you ever attend Dead Creek Day and stay kind of through the evening. That's a lot of fun as well.
Yeah, less than a half a pound for a saw-whet. They're like 5 to 6 ounces. They're tiny.
That's great. All right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions that are being typed into the chat. Oh, wait, there it is. Yay, Kate, thank you. Is 70 birds a good site for nest building instructions, is her first question. And the second question, is mouse desiccants problematic for owls?
I'm not sure about the site. I'd have to go and look, Kate, but feel free to reach out and we can correspond back and forth. My email's on the Fish and Wildlife website for sure. More than willing to help with that. And you mean like mouse pellets, like mouse desiccant, as in like for prevention or as a control method? Yeah, I don't know a lot about that. I'd have to look into it. It's the SARS rodenticides that are most impactful to owls and other species, but I'll fully admit I don't know enough about that to fully understand. So that's worth following up on as well.
Jill, do we know much about the barn owl population here in Vermont? I know that they exist here in small numbers, but do we have much on them recently? I'm just curious.
No, I don't know much about them other than looking at eBird to see where some of the different places are where they're being observed. So I don't think we have a really good handle on barn owls specifically. But again, like our agricultural landscape really is conducive to that species for sure. So it'd be interesting to know more about them. Yeah.
Yeah, open barns are, great. You put that shelf in there because they're more of a shelf nester, and it's great when you get them. They're really fun, and they will just screech at you.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautiful bird.
All righty. Well, I think that we're rounding out to 1 o'clock. I want to thank everybody for joining us on this program about owls. We will post it to our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again or share it with some other friends, you're welcome to do that. And again, I put Jill's correct one, I might add, email in the chat in case anybody had any additional questions that they wanted to follow up on with Jill. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Jill, thank you so much for sharing with the Vermont owls for us. You all should start listening for owls because they're going to start calling, because they're going to start breeding. As she said, the great horned owls are early breeders. Next, we'll follow the barred owls. So start listening. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye, all.